The focus of this training video is sexual harassment at work. We're going to talk about what sexual harassment is, what are the types of sexual harassment, and give you lots of examples of sexual harassment at work.
So, what is sexual harassment? Illegal sexual harassment is defined in Connecticut law under Section 46A 60B8 as any unwelcome sexual advances or requests for sexual favors or any conduct of a sexual nature where either the conduct is made implicitly or explicitly a term and condition of your employment, or if employment decisions are based on whether or not you submitted to or rejected harassing conduct, or C, if the conduct has the purpose or effect of substantially interfering with your work performance or creating an intimidating or hostile or offensive working environment. Now that's a mouthful, it's a lot of concepts, so we're going to break that down into parts.
Robin, I remember hearing about a situation where a woman applied online for an administrative job. She was very excited about the job and thought she had really great experience. A week or two after she applied, she got a phone call from the hiring manager, and he said he was very interested in meeting her and asked him to meet her at the Howard Johnson's hotel. Now, she thought it was a little strange because the job would take place in an office setting right by her home, but she thought, well, if this is where he wants me to go, I'm interested in the job and I'm going to go there. She dressed very professionally for the interview. When she got to the hotel room, she knocked on the door. He answered, and there was candlelight set up, champagne there, and it was pretty obvious that what she would need to do for the job was much different than just give a good interview. But she really wanted to have the job, and so she gave in to his sexual advances and then got the job soon after.
Well, Kim, that is an exact example of quid pro quo sexual harassment. Quid pro quo sexual harassment is defined as this for that. So when someone in a position of power offers a benefit in exchange for sexual attention, or on the flip side, threatens your job if you refuse their sexual advances, it's quid pro quo harassment.
There's lots of examples we could give of quid pro quo harassment. The example of the administrative job that we discussed before is the perfect example. Someone has offered you a job in return for sexual favors. It could not only be a job, but maybe a promotion, or it could be some kind of threat to your current job, like cutting your hours if you don't date your supervisor, or offering you a worse schedule or even a better schedule if you send your boss photographs of yourself. It's really either that you're going to get something or there's a threat of something bad happening to you if you don't give in to whatever the person who is harassing you is asking for.
Kim, is there any way that an employer can avoid liability for this type of quid pro quo harassment?
Well, quid pro quo harassment typically involves a manager, because typically a manager is the one who has the ability to either offer you something or take something away. And there's no way to really, for a company to really escape liability for a manager's actions in this kind of harassment.
Okay. Well, I had a situation recently, or saw a situation recently, where there was a group of employees in the work setting. It was a group of women who tended to hang around in the break room at lunchtime and breaks and talk about their sex lives and talk about sexualized books that they had read, such as 50 Shades of Grey, other things, and make jokes. And they were really enjoying themselves in the workplace. But the men in the workplace tended to avoid that area because they felt uncomfortable possibly being the butt of these women's jokes. And even some of the other women in the workplace didn't want to go into the break room at lunchtime because if they didn't participate in this joking around conduct, they were called prudes or other unfavorable names by these workers. Is that also discriminatory?
Yes, Robin, that's what we call a hostile work environment. It's when a coworker, supervisor, or a third party is making repeated inappropriate and unwelcome sexual comments or advances or requests in the workplace. And what you're describing is really that. It's a number of employees creating a hostile environment for other employees. It can include things like widespread sexual favoritism. This could be verbal, like you were discussing, making those kind of jokes. It could be physical, a lot of touching around the workplace, or anything visual as well.
And Kim, is it based upon that these women really thought that they were just being funny and telling jokes and talking to each other in the workplace?
Well, it really doesn't matter what they thought. It really matters how other people would perceive it or feel when being around those kind of comments.
So some other examples of a hostile work environment are, as we were talking about here, where people at work talk about sex all day or joke around about sex. But it can also be more visual, like where there are posters of scantily dressed models hanging up on the walls in the workplace, or they used to call them pinup girls, or calendars. Comments that people make about other employees' bodies or how their clothes fit or things like that. Someone at work touching you without your consent can be sexual harassment. It can also be as egregious as to rise to the level of sexual assault. And in that case, you can also go to the police about it. But it's something that your employer needs to prevent as well.
Robin, I'm just wondering, are we getting to the point in our society where you can't even shake someone's hand at work or put a hand on a shoulder?
No, I don't think that shaking someone's hand would be considered to be a hostile work environment. And again, we're talking about sexual conduct, but you are right, Kim, that some people are more open to being touched than others. And you should really look at the way a person responds. If you put your hand on their shoulder and they kind of flinch away, they're possibly a person that doesn't want to be touched. And maybe it would be a good idea to just ask someone if they're okay with you putting your hands on them. There's really, other than a handshake when you're meeting someone, there's no real need to touch people in the workplace. Other examples of a sexually hostile work environment can be using sexually derogatory words to refer to employees, such as referring to female employees as bitches or hoes, or referring to male employees as studs, or other terms like that. And of course, there's always the example of employees making mooing noises outside a room where an employee who was pumping breast milk for her child, and the employees thought that that was funny and again made the mooing noises. That can also be a sexually hostile work environment.
Sexual harassment isn't a compliment, it's an abuse of power. It's not funny, and it's not a way to show someone you like them or you're interested in them. Sexual harassment makes people feel small and threatened, and it really affects the work environment and the morale around the office. It's used to demean people. We don't want to forget that often we're talking about men sexually harassing women, but really a person of any gender can harass a person of any other gender, and it doesn't matter what their sexual orientation is. It doesn't require touching, although it can include touching, and it doesn't matter if it was meant to be a joke or a compliment, it can still be sexual harassment. It can happen inside and outside of work, and it even happens sometimes in school settings or in housing settings as well.
Right. In fact, as you said earlier, it's a good reason for an employer to stay on top of the work environment and make sure that sexual harassment isn't happening and that there's not a hostile work environment, because it affects the morale so much. It really will affect worker productivity if you allow your employees to be subjected to that negative work environment. So what makes a work environment, or any environment for that matter, sexually hostile? You have to consider whether the conduct is severe or pervasive. Does the conduct interfere with an employee's work performance? If the conduct is that extreme that you can't concentrate at work or are constantly focused on how you can avoid the people who are creating the hostile work environment, then it interferes with your performance. Is the conduct threatening or humiliating? Making jokes at other people's expense is not good for the company, it's not good for the employees. What's the nature of the conduct? In these cases, we're talking about sexual harassment, and so this conduct would have to be sexual in order to be a sexually hostile work environment. However, we can have harassment and a hostile work environment based on other protected classes, such as race or color or national origin, and any of our other protected classes. How frequent is the conduct? That's another issue in determining whether the conduct is pervasive or severe.
Robin, can sexual harassment be one event, or does it have to be multiple events?
Well, there's generally a scale. If there is only one event, it would have to be a very severe event. So, for example, sexually assaulting somebody only has to happen once before it's obviously sexual harassment. However, an off-color joke is not necessarily considered severe, so it would have to happen more frequently in order to be considered pervasive.
Really, lots of people are protected by the sexual harassment laws at work. It's not just the employees themselves, but it can also include interns, temporary workers, and in the housing setting, it can include the tenants that live there. And it also includes visitors to places of public accommodation, like a restaurant or the mall.
So, for example, if you run a restaurant or a store in the mall, your employees are protected from sexual harassment, but so are the people who come to patronize your facility. So, who can be a sexual harasser? Obviously, like we talked about before, in a quid pro quo harassment situation, it's usually a supervisor or manager. But those people can also participate in creating a hostile and offensive working environment. It can be a coworker. It could also be a vendor or supplier or someone else who comes and visits your work site or does work at your work site. It can be a contractor, a temporary worker, and other employees
Robin,
or other people.
is an employer responsible if one of their employees is harassing a vendor?
They could be, because that vendor can very easily go back to his or her employer and complain that they're being sexually harassed while they're trying to do their job at your company. Then their company will contact your company, and your company will be requested to have that harassment stop, and an employee engaging in that harassment may face discipline.
This reminds me of a situation I had heard about where a person delivering water was coming in regularly and being harassed by the employees at the place he was delivering the water to.
Yeah, and his employer has an obligation to keep him safe in his workplace. And so I'm sure that that employer reached out to the place where he was being harassed and told them that they expected them to respond and stop the harassment.
Well, sexual harassment, when you typically think about it, it's happening at the workplace, right? Where the person is doing their job every day. But we really don't, the sexual harassment laws are really not limited to just the workplace itself. They cover office and holiday parties, happy hour after work, business travel. And, when I think of those examples, I think of places where people feel a little bit more relaxed. It's not as formal as the workplace. Sometimes alcohol is involved. And we hear a lot of stories about sexual harassment happening in these more informal settings. We've also been getting an influx of cases where there's sexual harassment on social media, either through direct messages or sometimes people will post pictures of themselves that their coworkers can see because they're invited to see those as friends on the social media. We're seeing text messages of inappropriate pictures being sent to coworkers. And although these things aren't necessarily work related, they spill into the workplace the next day. Really, sexual harassment can happen almost anywhere.
And it's true, Kim, it actually makes our job a little bit easier sometimes with the text messaging going on, because this is all evidence that can be preserved in a lawsuit.
Yeah, Robin, we sure have a lot of pictures in our case files that I never expected to see.
Agreed. So, for example, I remember that case that we were talking about where an employee actually took a picture of his private parts and sent them to a coworker. And this was done outside of work, and it was sent to her personal cell phone at home. However, it definitely came into the workplace the next day, both when she complained to her HR department and really felt uncomfortable and didn't want to work with that employee or have to see that employee at work anymore.
There's lots of examples of sexual harassment, Robin. We hear all the time about the propositions, the threats, the jokes, the comments, the unwanted touching, the gestures, the use of pornographic materials at work, and we have a lot of complaints of noises and leering.
That's true, Kim. And can it be said that employees are just too sensitive to this type of conduct and that they're complaining about things that they should just ignore or suck it up as part of the workplace?
No one should have to tolerate sexual harassment at work. No one should have to toughen up to that kind of behavior.
Okay, now we're going to ask you to pause the video and take quiz number 1 in the materials section.
Question number 1. Is it sexual harassment to ask a coworker on a date? A, yes. B, no. Or C, it depends. The answer is really it depends. We all know that many people go on dates with coworkers, assuming there's no policy that your employer has for against fraternization. However, I think it's all in the number of times you ask and how you're asking. If you ask a coworker out on a date the first time and they say no or they say they're busy, you might ask a second time. But if the second time they say they need to wash their hair and you're realizing that they're just not really interested, this is a case where persistence isn't going to get you anywhere, except maybe into a lawsuit. When someone says no several times, it's best not to ask again, and it could lead to a claim of sexual harassment.
Now, question 2. Can sexual harassment happen outside of work? A, yes, or B, no. Well, as we've discussed, sexual harassment can happen any place, both inside and out of work. And when it happens outside of work, it often gets dragged back into the workplace and it can affect many parts of the work environment.
Question number 3. My supervisor told me that if I wanted to improve my performance, I should meet him for dinner at his apartment. Is this A, quid pro quo harassment, B, hostile environment harassment, or C, neither? Well, this is very likely quid pro quo harassment. In other words, you do something for me, come to my apartment for dinner, and I'll do something for you, help you improve your performance.
And question 4. My coworkers are constantly discussing their sex lives at work, and it's making it hard for me to concentrate and to get my work done. Is this quid pro quo harassment, a hostile work environment, or neither? Well, this appears to be a hostile work environment. No one should have to deal with trying to avoid listening to their coworkers talk about their sex lives or other issues while they're trying to do their work. The employer needs to put a stop to this conduct before they wind up having a CHRO complaint.